Hey everyone, and welcome to our week 4 summary. This week is our third week on institutions. We're going to be looking at the judicial branch of the federal government as well as the state courts. This week we have two big questions to ask. The first is, if the court system is not well equipped to make laws, then what role does the court actually play in environmental policy? And since federal judges aren't elected, what role does the court play in environmental politics? So before we turn to looking at our class materials for the week, let's do a really quick overview of the court system in the US. So the US has what's called a dual court system. We've got federal courts and we've got state courts. The federal courts derive their power from the federal Constitution. The Constitution of the United States established the Supreme Court and gave Congress the power to determine the exact makeup of that court, as well as the makeup of all the lower courts. So ultimately, Congress gave us district courts, which are where the vast majority of federal cases begin, circuit courts of appeals, which is where you would appeal if you don't like the ruling by the district court, and ultimately the federal Supreme Court. Now, the federal Supreme Court is your final court of appeal in federal cases. It's also your final court of appeal in state cases. So we have that federal system over here, also have our state system. So we have state trial courts, state appeals courts, state Supreme Courts, and then ultimately the US Supreme Court at the top of that too. Now in states, those structures vary slightly state by state, but the general structure is the same. We have the place where cases originate, where they are appealed again, and ultimately where they are finally appealed in the Supreme Court. Now, obviously that would mean that the Supreme Court hears a lot of appeals, right? They hear all the appeals from the federal courts and from the state courts. But ultimately the Supreme Court gets to decide which cases they hear. So they don't hear all the cases that get appealed to them. They have to decide to hear these cases and grant cert, as it's called. Now, the court systems deal with different types of cases. That's why we have two systems. So we have the federal court system, which deals with criminal and civil cases that have something to do with federal law. Unsurprisingly, this is, if you break a federal law like copyright law, you get prosecuted in federal court. But also, these courts hear cases when people are suing a federal agency, when two states or more states are in conflict with each other, and under certain other circumstances. So one of the cases we're going to be looking at this week, West Virginia versus EPA, the state of West Virginia was suing the EPA, therefore that was heard in federal courts. Now, state courts hear anything within state jurisdiction. That means anything having to do with state laws or a conflict with the state. So we're going to hear two cases that are beginning in state courts. We're going to hear about two cases beginning in state courts this week, including Held versus Montana, where we have individuals suing the state of Montana for not obeying, in their opinion, not obeying the state constitution. Now, these different cases ultimately may make it to the Supreme Court. Now, West Virginia versus EPA has already been decided by the Supreme Court. We might see that Held versus Montana eventually makes its way there. It's still being appealed at this point. Now, all these courts have to wait for cases to come to them. So the Supreme Court has to wait for cases to come to them before they can decide which cases to hear. But that's true of all the courts, right? Even the courts don't have a say over what cases they hear, still have to wait for the case to be brought, which means that unlike the political branches, Congress and the president, or in the case of states, we have state legislatures and governors. Unlike those political branches, the courts have to wait for a case. They can't just react to events. They also can't choose what they want to deal with, right? So if Congress decides, hey, we want to make a law on this, they can just do that. But if the court says, hey, we want to weigh in on this law, they have to wait for someone to bring a case, and for that case, if it's the Supreme Court, to ultimately get appealed all the way up there. So the courts are very slow and can't initiate action. These two weaknesses make it a lot harder for them to influence policy. Now we see also that federal judges are not elected, they are appointed. So the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoints judges at all 3 levels of the federal court system. So that means that judges, because they're not elected, may not have to worry about politics quite as much, which may insulate them from having to deal with environmental politics. Now, that all said, the court still has a pretty big role in environmental policy and politics, which we will look at in our materials. But just sort of a brief preview of that, we can see that the courts have the power, known as judicial review, to say what the law is, right? Chief Justice Marshall, in the case Marbury versus Madison, says that it is ultimately the power of the courts to say what the law is. So they may have to wait until someone questions what the law is, but then they have that final say. It's important to remember that they cannot actually enforce their own rulings. So when I call it the final say, it may not be. The other branches may choose to just ignore what the court says. And that has happened before. It doesn't happen very often because typically the public does not like it when elected officials ignore the Supreme Court. So elected officials, because they want to be reelected, will usually still go along with what the Supreme Court says. Now, I also call it the final say with that exception, but the political branches often can redo things. So the court can say, well, this is what the law means. And if Congress doesn't agree, they can rewrite the law. They can say, no, that's not what it means here. We'll clarify it for you. So again, when we say the court has the final say, we know that actually there are many ways that the political branches can react. So ultimately, even though the court seems like it should be insulated from politics, at least the Supreme Court, and ultimately unable to make policy, that is generally not the case. The Supreme Court has a lot of power to influence policy and a large role to play in environmental politics. And our materials for this week are going to get into more specifics about that. We can see that the court has 4 key roles in environmental policy. They can force policy action. So that means they can make the bureaucrats do something and actually, follow through on a law that Congress has made. They can delay policy action, which means that maybe they can say to the bureaucracy, hey, hold on a second, don't do what you're doing, stop. They can shape policy. So they could say, hey, we don't really like the way you're enforcing policy. We don't think that's in accordance with the law. So here's how you should enforce it instead. And they can do what's called constitutional review. They can basically say, is the government acting within their constitutional powers? They can interpret the Constitution. That ties back to that quote I paraphrased from Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury versus Madison. That established the power of judicial review, which says that the court can determine if any action of the political branches are in accordance with the Constitution. And they can say what the Constitution is actually supposed to say, right? Congress can say, I think the Commerce Clause means X, but the court can ultimately say, no, it means Y. And the Commerce Clause is one of the important ones for environmental politics because the Commerce Clause, among other things, allows Congress to regulate our waterways because waterways pass between states and therefore we can have commerce happen on our waterways, right? Boats, shipping, goods and whatnot. So how much power does that give Congress to actually regulate our waterways? Not just the boats on them, but maybe the kinds of fuel the boats use, or who gets to dump toxic things into the water. So we can see then that those 4 roles, I should say, give the court a lot of power over environmental policy making. The reading also points out that they have a role in environmental politics as well, not only in the fact that they're shaping the policies that are made, and therefore influencing the politics of making policy, but also in terms of telling the public what to pay attention to, right? When the Supreme Court takes a case, suddenly people pay attention to that issue a lot more, right? The news sort of covers it all of a sudden. So we can see that the courts also have that more rhetorical role in shaping politics as well. So after you've looked at that sort of grounding in these different roles that the court can play in both politics and policy, we'll turn to an article by Carson and several co-authors, which looks at sort of the findings of a workshop put on by UCLA and others that talks about policymaking in sort of the shadow of the court. So the other reading, and me just now, point out that by making policy, the court influences what policy will be made, right? So by shaping, accelerating or slowing down policies, the court actually has a big influence on politics, right? Because if Congress knows, the court might say, no, we don't want this particular law being enforced in this way, but Congress is like, we want it enforced in that way. They're going to make the law really clear. They're not going to leave it up to the bureaucrats anymore. Because remember, we said that Congress often lets bureaucrats make the decisions because they don't want sort of the political consequences of making these specific regulations. But maybe if they know they want things enforced a certain way, they're going to have to start doing that and deal with the political fallout because they know that the courts might otherwise say, no, the bureaucracy doesn't have the freedom to interpret this expansively. So we can see then that policymakers have to consider the court when they start to make policy. And that reading talks about different ways that policymakers can consider the court, and not everyone at these workshops agreed with those different ways or agreed that those ways would actually work, but there's some interesting ideas in there. So I encourage you to read the background and then sort of skim through those ideas just to get a feel for them. After that, we turn to three important cases on environmental policy. First, we look at West Virginia versus EPA, which is considered a landmark case insofar as it was the first case in about 15 years that had been on a big environmental issue that the Supreme Court had decided to take up, and insofar as it really changes the way the bureaucracy can engage with environmental regulations. We then have Held versus Montana. That is a case that is currently working its way through the state court system in Montana, but a judge recently ruled in that case. So we're going to look at the consequences of that ruling, even if that ruling may eventually be overturned. We're also going to look at California versus ExxonMobil. That case literally just got filed in state courts over just a couple days ago when I'm filming this. And that case, we'll see as it works its way through that trial court and probably through the appeals system, what ultimately happens with it. There are many cases that are similar to it happening right now, but this one is considered the sort of biggest at this point. So you have two readings on that one that gives you some background and one that compares it to some of the other cases that we're seeing be brought right now. So as usual, there are optional videos as well. Those are going to give you more background than I gave you in this summary. So if you're not familiar with the courts, if you haven't taken an Intro to American Government class, I really encourage you to check out those optional videos by Crash Course or the optional reading in the Crutz American Government textbook that's online. Finally, let's look at the key takeaways for this week. The first key takeaway is that the courts have a lot of structural weaknesses, but ultimately they do overcome them a lot of the time and can play a big role in environmental policy. And because of their ability to promote, shape, and even nullify policies, they play a key role in environmental politics too. Congress and the president, and of course state lawmakers, are often forced to react to court rulings, and they may have to work hard to find ways to adapt to or even circumvent these rulings. So we can see that the courts, even though they're considered the non-political branch, plays a big role in both policymaking and politics.